making connections and the investment of men often reminds us of our overall purpose. And sometimes, we all have a tendency in our human, you know, reasoning and mindsets kind of drift away from the intent of things. And the reality of it, we start enjoying spiritual things and we forget about the growth and the reproduction of it. And, it happens to us all. We have to remind ourselves in some of the best disciple groups, we got to remind ourselves of the spiritual reproductive purpose and growth purposes, or we'll become bystanders.
Yep.
We'll become bystanders. So, with that said, I want to remind us of how we started off together. We were in Luke 6:40. We were learning those lessons. We were repeating them, and our goal was to accomplish spiritual reproduction. And it starts with, it's intrinsic, but the example and the model becomes, God's word, His teaching. So, but as we learn His word, something inside of us grows and reproduces as well. Character develops, when we hear, those lessons. So I want us to do the same. I want to kind of get us back to that. But I can't do it without us being in agreement, So I want us to learn this lesson, and let's agree that we won't move forward until each of us can repeat it. All right. The style of it, or even the expectations reminds us of that. All right. But I want us to get back to that. I want us to get back to having an expectation that when I come back next week, I have the responsibility as a student to share what I know or remember about the lesson. And if not, we'll gravitate away and develop some negative discipline. So yeah. Now, how does that sound? What does that sound like to everybody?
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Sounds good.
So sounds like we're all in agreement. So let's go to our text in Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at verse 1 and 2. And as I mentioned, sometimes looks like it's gonna be next year for sure. We're gonna eventually get into the Sermon on the Mount. It make you smile, huh, Robert? I've been saying that. We will, I promise you. But we're gonna take our time because I want to make sure that, and again, I say this often, but I'm fascinated at the strategy of each author or each gospel writer. Like we take that for granted, but Matthew had an intent strategy in verses 1 and 2. It's strategic. And the more I look at it, the more I study it, it makes sense. He was preparing us for the Beatitudes. But we have to understand what his intent was in verse 1 and 2 before we can properly receive the way he wanted us to view his perspective of the Beatitude, or Jesus' perspective. Jesus' perspective. He saw Jesus in a certain way, and he wanted to convey that to the audience. So, one, I think I shared this with you guys, but if I hadn't said it in your ear sight, you'll hear me say it now. Matthew actually wrote the first gospel. All right. His gospel was the earliest in circulation, maybe about 10 to 15 years after the ascension. And actually it started off, hold on, sorry, I got somebody trying to jump in. Hold on.
Keusi, is it a guy named Ozzy?
No, this is Timothy from Abuja.
Okay, that may be Ozzy. So that's my guy.
Okay.
If you,
Well, send him the link, but we got two guys then. So
I sent him the link that you sent.
okay.
Um, maybe it's coming to you to approve it. I don't
No,
know.
no, I'm actually on WhatsApp right now. I got a message on WhatsApp to
Oh no, that's not my guy then.
yeah.
No.
I just sent it to him. Uh, I think if they put in the passcode or what, I don't know if it, I don't know how. I didn't have to approve anybody on here now.
Okay.
Matter of fact, everybody was able to log in before me sometimes. So yeah, so I think he should be able to log in.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right, I just sent it. Timothy. So so Matthew's gospel was the first gospel in circulation, and it was about 10 to 15 years after the ascension, post-resurrection appearance of Jesus. However, Matthew's gospel didn't have narrative at first. It was actually titled The Sayings or the Teachings of Jesus. And it was Matthew's compilation, all the teachings imagine all the teachings of Jesus in the book of Matthew or the gospel of Matthew being without the narrative. That's what it was at first. It was just all of the sayings of Jesus without the narrative, and it was written in Hebrew. See, it was written in Hebrew because Matthew's intent wasn't to circulate. Remember, in the first century, if they circulated any kind of literature or publications, they had to write it in the Greek language, or they were in danger of being punished by the king or the Caesar. All right. However, Matthew wrote his teachings of Jesus in Hebrew because it was for his ears only. See, Matthew was a Levite and a tax collector in the priesthood. So, as things gravitated from before Christ and most people not really having a lot of access to writing materials, paper sleeves, and ink, right? That ink dried up before you even wrote the first character, finished the first character. So you had to have finances to actually write. It took, you had to, just the average person couldn't write because they didn't even have enough finances to write things. But Matthew was a tax collector, so he was and what am I trying to say? What do they call the elite people in society? I don't know, it's slipping my mind. All right, but anyway, it'll come to me. But anyway, uh, he pretty much had a lot of resources, so he had access to purchase writing materials and in his own. But if you think about it, if he wrote in Hebrew, he had to have hidden this. This was not something that he could share with people, or he would get in huge trouble. So when they first circulated after the post-resurrection, I mean after Jesus, the post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, and they first circulated the gospel, these things, just kind of got started to get circulated. And eventually went back later and added the narrative. Now, from what I hear, is that Mark's gospel was the first complete book circulated. And after that circulated, then Matthew went back and wrote his narrative. All right. And I say that to say this. His sayings or teachings of Jesus was what he remembered word for word from Jesus. So what I'm talking about us, reminding us about, if it wasn't for Matthew's gospel, we wouldn't, if it wasn't for Matthew's discipline as a disciple, we wouldn't have any of the gospel, or most likely his gospel. Come on, Robert.
Yeah, I wanted to, I saw Fred ask a question, and I had the same one going through my head. Can you kind of define or elaborate on what you mean by narrative?
Yes, yes, yes. All right. So all right, like the Beatitudes, the narrative is verse 1 and 2. The teaching is verse 3 through whatever. Let me keep going again. Let me go to another. Let me go back.
So the narrative would be the story,
Yes, the stories.
what was going on,
Yes.
as opposed
The
to
narrative is verse 1 and 2.
Yeah, part of that, the part of verse 1 and 2 is part of the narrative.
So is that kind of like describing the setup or describing the scene of the play?
Yes, yes. All right, I'm trying to find an area that would be a good example. These Beatitudes were full of teaching. That's teaching. That's teaching. That's teaching. I'm thinking y'all can see my screen. I apologize. Let me go back. All right. Y'all see my screen? Nope, not yet. Here we go. I'm reading. Yeah, my computer's acting funny. Hold on. That's not the screen I wanted to share. My Discovery Bible just disappeared on. What we got, Chris? All right, come on, walk us through that, Chris, as I look for my screen again.
So just trying to search on some more information around the relationship of the collection, I guess the sayings that you're just speaking of to the full canon of Matthew. So what I came across was that I guess the Hebrew, the early collection was dated AD 50 to 60, which is kind of right along the timeline you were sharing, like 10 to 15 years, maybe a little bit, 15 to 20 years after the resurrection. And then it has the Greek gospel coming later, using, I guess, like you just mentioned, kind of looking at Mark, Matt, and his earlier collection, then adding unique material that's specific to his gospel.
Yeah. Excellent. All right. And so thanks, Chris. When we think about what I was looking at earlier before my Discovery Bible kind of cut off on me, we're in Matthew chapter 5. And a lot of that, is a lot of those. The first part, verse 1 and 2, is considered a narrative, right? And we often overlook what I'm discussing as teaching because Matthew explained the setup, but inside of the setup was what I would call a posture of teaching. And that's what we're interpreting as we study verses 1 and 2. But it in literature or literary works, verse 1 and 2 would be considered the narrative. If you see, the teaching is Jesus' direct words saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Matter of fact, the verse literally says he opened his mouth and began to teach them, saying, and then the teaching comes next, the words of the teacher. And he says, "Blessed are the poor in the spirit." So in the compilation of Matthew, we would assume that the verse 1 and 2, which is the narrative around it, the setting and the scenery, he didn't explain that early on. It was just a compilation of the words he heard Jesus teach. And then later he goes back and reflects on this particular period of teaching and says, hold on, this teaching just didn't happen, but Jesus crowds were gathered and Jesus saw crowds. And before he taught us, he went up on the mountain and he sat down, and then the disciples came to him and he began to teach. So that's the narrative. And as I was scrolling through, there's a bunch of teaching here because it's the Sermon on the Mount. So give to the poor. This is verse 1 in chapter 6. That's, teaching. Constantly teaching. Constantly teaching. Constantly teaching. Verse 7, teaching, do not judge. Those are teaching. Ask and it will be given. Enter through the narrow gate. Beware of these false prophets. Those are teaching. Therefore, there's a parable. A lot of them are parables. Here's narrative. Verse 28. When Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teachings. For he was teaching them as one having authority, not as a scribe. So again, this is teaching. And this is actually
Where is
early
that?
on. Come on, somebody has something.
What was that verse you just read?
This is chapter 7.
Oh, okay. I'm in the wrong chapter.
You know, we get all the way down to verse 28, and then a narrative kind of starts. You know, the setting, the story behind the teaching. But everything else was teaching. Verse 8, I think it's more narrative before he teaches. When Jesus came down from the mountain, so once again, large crowds followed him. So that's narrative. And the leper came. I'm willing to be cleansed. So all these, so just imagine those narratives not being there early on. And all it was a compilation of the teachings Matthew had memorized from Jesus as a disciple, which wasn't nothing unusual. Some disciples had it. Matter of fact, Peter had his committed to memory. He refused to write it down. Matthew, however, being a tax collector, wrote it down. It may have something to do with Peter's background. Peter was a fisherman. You know, he may or may not have access to write, or maybe he didn't even know how to write. I don't know. But he committed his to memory.
Okay, is it correct? What I've seen in recent years of what I've read, Mark was a disciple of Peter, and that he heard Peter teaching about what Jesus said. So some scholars say that it's actually the gospel of Peter that Mark is restating. Could be wrong.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yeah, correct. So what they say is Mark was caring for Peter. You know, when they were arrested, they were able to have visitors come in actually and spend. If I'm correct, I think a visitor could even stay overnight. But they would come and attend to those incarcerated. They would bring them food and visitors, and Mark was attending to Peter, and there was a gathering of people, and Peter was constantly sharing, you know, about his experience and encounter, the life and teaching of Jesus. And there was a group present in Rome listening. And Peter was walking them through teachings and narratives and situations, and the people was telling Peter from what's said about the situation is the people were imploring Peter to write this stuff down. It's like, this is great for you to teach it to us, but will you put it in a manuscript and give it to us? In some kind of way, they said Peter refused. You know, basically was explaining to them that, hey, this is oral transmission. It was transmitted to me orally. I'm transmitted to you orally. And then Peter went back. Then Mark went back later and wrote it down. You know, and to satisfy the request. But that shows what great or what level of a disciple Mark was. So yeah, but this stuff happened through disciple making. Yeah. But just giving those examples, and my purpose of doing that is it's apparent that those guys memorized his words exactly. And along the way, that memorization developed something in them they didn't know they possessed. And what they possessed, or what it developed in them that they possessed, actually started to come out years later. You know, as these narratives begin to circulate, you know, and as they were tested and tried their fate, and then we hear. I have a book here. Should be close by. Yeah. This is called gonna be backwards for some reason. Chronicles of the Apostles. My camera, let me turn this camera light off. Chronicles of the Apostles. This is a compilation of 1, 2. I think I got a 6-volume set. All right. And what it does is it gives the narrative around the disciples of Jesus. It gives names, women too, of the disciples of Jesus, and it gives a brief explanation of their achievements, their accomplishments, and things that happened to them, after Jesus. And these were some bad dudes. Excellent. Thanks. Yep. Excellent. Right. Yep. But these were some bad dudes. But the way their lives ended shows their growth. I can't remember who said it, but somebody was talking about the difference in the first century followers of Christ and us today. And the biggest difference is, they were willing to die for what they believed in. They were willing to die for what they believed in. If we were threatened with death, would we do it? What we do it. I'm ranting and raving right now. Well, you asked me a question when I got back from my trip to Abuja. I found out that there was some persecution of Christians going on in the northern part. All right. It just didn't affect the group or the people we were at. And again, the capital city, a lot of that terrorist stuff really doesn't impact the capital city as much as it does in the rural places. All right. But north of Kaduna State is where the heavily Muslim militants live. And there are, some Christians. That's why I mentioned to you guys when most of those people grew up in the Muslim faith, but when they convert to Christianity, they have to relocate for their families and stuff. And those killings are happening to those people who try to start churches and refuse to relocate. Most. So yeah. But I say that to say there are people still around the world who are willing to die for their faith. They're willing to die for their faith. They know the risk. They know the things. It doesn't make it right, doesn't make it fair. But hey, would we live for God if we had to face those circumstances? And do we have enough downloaded on the inside of us that through those types of persecutions and oppressions, do we have enough to transfer, all right, and make relevant? So yeah.
Well, could you elaborate some on that? Because that's been bothering me for a couple of weeks. If I'm going to go, let's say I'm going back to that prison Bradley took me to. Got a bunch of Muslim guys, and they're pretty much protected by their group there. As long as you stay a Muslim, you're kind of protected, sort of. So, what's the gospel message is a little bit different than if I'm going to ask somebody to be converted, around my hometown. It's follow Jesus and he'll take care of you. I'm gonna go to that prison and tell this guy, said, I want you to be converted, but you probably get hurt or killed if you do. It's a different message. What do you say?
It's a different, it's not necessarily a different message, it's a different method. So I have to go in building relationships, or I learn to build common ground. So it's called finding people of peace. Luke chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, Luke chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, or 1 through 6 kind of talks about Jesus' strategy to his disciples as he sent them out about finding people of peace. And so you find common ground, you know. So most likely we have to learn the stories of the Old Testament. You know, we have to talk about the forefathers, you know, and we have to help like Peter did. If we look at Peter and Paul's method of sharing the gospel, man, they went back with a narrative about the genealogy of Jesus, you know, and they kind of showed how Moses and Abraham believed God in the coming Messiah. And it really was about validation of who the Messiah is and how did Christ fulfill those prophecies of Messiah. And for them, that's where it starts. We can't start in our gospel book, you know, with those people. But we have to be a relationship, you know, so it is a challenge because, you know, they're not going to just sit and hear Jesus died for my sin, you know, but it's a method, it's a relationship building. I think I shared the story about, man, I got 2 Muslim guys that I really loved and cared for when I was in prison, but they couldn't convince me not to live for Christ, and I couldn't convince them not to go and live for an Islamic faith. But it was over a while after our relationships were merged that they began to reflect. And I say it the way this one guy said it to me. They talk about, if you can show me how to walk in the light of Yeshua or Jesus, I'll consider it. So now we got to talk about what was the light of Christ? What was the light of Jesus? Like, we have to talk about his accomplishment, you know, and those types of things. But it is a different method and it's challenging. So yeah. Chris, I'm just as engaged with your narratives. I have to catch up and make sure I see what's going on before I pass.
I found some information that is kind of that complements what you were teaching us around the narratives, kind of setting up key teaching blocks, but also interwoven within the chapters, like you touched on, like 5, 1, and 2 is a narrative, and then I think you mentioned also at the end, towards 7, at the end, it's 28 and 29 on the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes. Excellent. Thanks. All right. Does that help answer the question, Rob?
Yes. Thank you so much.
It is challenging. You know, I was sitting back talking to Timothy. He's my contact on the ground in the booth in Nigeria, and just kind of hearing about how he came to Christ. He was the first in his family. His entire family was Muslim. He came to Christ at a young age, and basically his family ostracized him. And he had a lot of younger brothers, very young. And eventually he won his mom to Christ. Together they won his dad to Christ. Then eventually they won their older brother to Christ. And he has 3 older brothers, if I'm correct. The one above him was the last one that they won to Christ. And they call him Pentecost now. And he was actually assigned to me and Zena as our security and guide while we were there. But when you think about that, you know, him winning his family to Christ was through relationships. You know, it wasn't words, it was over time, and it was a process of them actually seeing how they live out these things in their lives. And eventually it made sense, or eventually it made it to them make no sense. Right? They begin to see a disconnect. So yeah. Appreciate you guys. Great discussion. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. What we're going to learn is interpretations of 1 and 2. All right. going to learn interpretations around 1 and 2. And and the reason why I call them interpretations is because when Matthew went back and added the narrative, it meant something to the crowd. What Jesus did, it meant something to the disciples. And there's an interpretation of Jesus seeing the crowd that Matthew wanted to convey. So he was conveying his when he went back and added his narratives, he was writing to followers of Christ. First century followers, second century followers of Christ were second and third generation disciples. They weren't called followers of Christ. You know, they were called disciples of Paul, disciples of Timothy, disciples of, you know, Matthew and Thomas and Cleophas and all of those individuals. So, but we call them the first, second century church. They were disciples. What their titles were, you know, followers of Christ, eventually, because that's what a disciple was. You know, he was a follower of his rabbi. So that's where the term followers of Christ comes from. It was all rabbinical terms and inbred thought. But we transitioned it into our Western view of Christianity, and it didn't originate with us. So those are terms that mean something. So when we look at this verse and it simply says Jesus saw the crowd, that means something. In the Hebrew culture, Hebraic thought, in the rabbinical thought, it means something. He went up on the mountain. It's not just physical. It's not about him actually going up on the mountain that's important. It's the interpretation of him going on the mountain. All right. And that's what Matthew wanted to convey. And he was strategic the way he wrote it. It wasn't about Jesus sitting down in a comfortable position to teach out for hours. It was about what it meant and what the interpretation of him sitting down meant. And it wasn't about his disciples coming to him. It was about what it meant when his disciples came to him. So we have to study the interpretation, and I'm learning that. But to do so, it starts with expectation. All right. Anybody remember the 3 expectations? Rick, John, Fred, I'm gonna ask you 3 to hold up before you respond.
Must be received personally. Must be taught in such a way that it's easily repeatable and must be repeated strategically.
All right. So those are 3, but we titled those the 3 must do. All right.
Okay.
And I've been teaching this to a few groups, and we've been off. The turkey do something to you, man. Every time I ate a good full plate of that turkey, boy, next thing you know, my eyes were closed. So that turkey may have my memory fog because I've taught this to several groups. Come on, Bill.
I didn't hear exactly what Bradley said, but the 3 that I have was a little more lengthy, I think, than what he said.
Okay, let me hear what you got.
I had put the number 1 was the disciples had an expectation of the teacher or the rabbi.
Excellent.
Number 2, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples.
Excellent.
Number 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
Thanks, Brother Bill. That's encouraging.
Is that the one you're talking about?
Impact my mind.
That means I write fast when you talk.
Yeah. Thanks.
I need to write those down.
Yeah. Well, we went back. We did talk about those 3 must do's, Bradley, but we added that as an explanation under, I think, one of these. But we had it came up in conversation.
That was the last. I missed the last 2 meetings of last month, or the last meeting or something, so I probably missed it. But
Okay.
Can you say those again, Mr. Bill?
I had number 1 was the disciples had an expectation of the teacher or rabbi, and then number 2, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples. And then number 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. All right. Excellent. All right. We want to make sure we all have it, and we want to adopt it in a similar way, or writing it down the same way. You ever wonder why it was hard to learn a lesson somebody taught you that you wanted to learn?
Yeah, I wonder that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason
What was
why
number
you
3?
wanted to learn it is probably because of the impact of understanding it happens after you hear the full lesson. It's like in your mind, you're like, man, they just connected a lot of dots. However, I took it all in like opening up a fire hydrant, you know, and the water just gushing out. So what I have to do is I have to go back and try to hear it in order. And I have to scrape off the topic points. First, I just want to learn the topic. I always say if somebody sits down and teaches me something, I want to make sure I understand the topic first. Forget about what they're going to say, but let me just understand what they title is. So these are expectations. So if I don't know nothing else, if I close, I remember that he taught me expectations, and there are 3 of them. So I remember the title. Now we explain, I can't remember. I think we did explain somewhat in John, Rick, and Fred. When we get to explain, and you give a group a chance to explain it, and I'm gonna get you guys to help me out. But I know you 3 have sat through this, so you're a little bit further along. So I don't want to ruin the discovery for everybody else. I want to give everybody else a chance for discovery. So that's the purpose of, that's the key to learning, is these discovery opportunities. So, but I'm learning that, let me go back first, teach the title. Now, let me make sure we have the topic, the outline points in the title. And what Bill just gave us in exact order and word for word, so I'm encouraged, is the outline point. One more time, Brother Bill.
I had number 1 was the disciples had an expectation of the teacher or rabbi. Number 2, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples. And 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
All right. One more time. Let's say it one more time. I want to make sure we all have it.
All right. The disciples had an expectation of the teacher or rabbi. Number 2, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples. Number 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
All right. One more time.
All right. Number 1, the disciples had an expectation of the teacher or rabbi. Number 2, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples. Number 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
All right. Now, somebody
Can
else.
I ask a question?
Yes.
Will we discuss what those expectations were?
I thought you never asked, Brother Bill. Brother Wayne. Yeah, that's great. That's a wise disciple and disciple maker. All right. But that's what these are supposed to do, create that curiosity to say, you know what? I hear the expectations, but what are they?
What are they? That's
Yeah,
the
what
key.
are they? Come on, Will.
Yeah, my couple questions. Is there a certain reason for using disciple rather than student, or teacher rather than rabbi, or Jesus rather than rabbi in the various points? That's
Yeah,
my first question. And the second question is, assume this is what we need to then model ourselves. Like when how you open the lesson was, let's reaffirm the expectation is you're teaching for us to retain and then reteach.
yes, yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
But,
So yes, and I'm going to explain that. So actually what we should do when we do this is first, we have to learn this and picture the person I want to transfer it to. That'll help my learning. So we all should have somebody in mind when I log in, when I log on, or when I join, is that, you know what, man, this person now, I don't know if it's this week, tomorrow, later today, but we should have somebody in mind. All right, now, because I have that person in mind, I got to make sure that what I hear, I write it down the way I hear it, because if I try to put it in my own words, I may misunderstand it. I may still not have it as clear in my heart as I need to. So to avoid miscommunication, let me just write it down the way the teacher said it. Let me not try to interpret it. Let me not try to change the words of it. Now, the words themselves are strategic and intentional. So which one is, we try to connect with the context in the audience that it was being given to. What word or what terms would they use? They would use disciple or talmid. So we use disciple or talmid instead of student. Because if I say student, I think about a Western student. I think about a college student, or God forbid, a inner city high school student. Woo, wee. I was that student. So we use disciple, right?
Gotcha.
So yeah, so now we can connect.
well,
All right, now, come
doesn't
on.
disciple go deeper than student? I mean,
It,
student is a disciple, you would say, is a student, a learner, and a follower. But a student does it by itself doesn't have to be a follower necessarily, huh? It can be one in the classroom.
correct. That's why, I'm going back to kind of clean it up. This is what I would suggest us to use, and this is what I've done over time as I wrote it. Because I'm the teacher, I'm learning this, and I'm like, in my mind now when I study, if I say student, I know I'm talking about a disciple. In my mind, there's no confusion or interchange, and I'm going to trace that rabbit or that trail all the way down until I have to explain exactly what this type of student is. But everybody may not do that. So for the sake of learning, let's say the disciple had an expectation of their rabbi. That's what we'll say. The disciple had an expectation, or the disciples had an expectation of their rabbi. We know that these disciples are talking about Jesus, but these disciples saw Jesus as their rabbi.
Mm-hmm.
When they say Jesus was the son of David or the son of God, that was a reference to him being the physical Messiah who would actually come back and restore the kingdom of Israel. And Jesus tells Peter at some point, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you. However, it's funny, when Jesus dies, Peter is the one who has the hardest time trying to process the fact that Jesus had resurrected himself. Well, God resurrected Jesus, however we want to say it. Because Jesus leaves, takes a third of the disciples and say, you know what? I left all and followed Jesus, but he's dead, so now I'm going back to go fishing for the rest of my life. because that's what that title meant. If he was going back to go fishing and abandoning his mission or call or whatever we want to say, that he committed to following Jesus. And then Jesus appears to him and on the Tiberia, Lake Tiberia, I think it was. Thanks, Chris. And so then when Jesus had this encounter and Jesus disappears, then it sets in and Peter's like, oh, gotta be the dumbest person in the world. And so now he goes back and now he's fully committed, Peter, that we see in the book of Acts. Jesus restored him. But it was something that wasn't processing for them. So I gotta respect that when they saw Jesus early on, they saw him as a rabbi. That was their context. So that's our context. And that was Matthew's purpose of writing this. He wasn't writing it to say, Jesus, the Son of God, the Lord and Savior of the world, the Redeemer, went up, saw the crowd. He wasn't referring to it that way. He wasn't referring to this ascension had anything to do with this went up on the mountain had anything to do with his ascension. He was literally referring to Jesus in these statements as a physical rabbi, the humanity of Jesus. He was expressing the humanity of Jesus from what Jesus taught them in his humanity. Now, this is the most important piece to that, because Jesus taught them to this in their humanity. They knew that they could actually live it out without ever having an ounce of deity in their lives. See, they knew the expectation was that, you know what, I can fully commit to this and model this myself because he taught this to me in his humanity. So there's no separation from me and him in this teaching or in this example. So Jesus saw the crowds. Eventually, God is going to expect you and I to see the crowds the way Jesus saw this crowd. Eventually, the way Jesus went up on this mountain, God is going to expect you and I to go up on a mountain for this purpose. I'll talk about that. I'll raise my eyebrows. If nothing else, that ought to make you tune in every week until I reveal what I'm talking about. And you sitting down, you should sit down the same way Jesus sat down for the same purpose he sat down. You should do it. And when you sit down, you ought to have the spirit of influence of people who want to come to you to hear you. When you sit down, it triggers something in them. And it makes those people in your spirit of influence want to come. And then you teach. Now, back to the expectation. We're going to get into that. All right. I know some of you guys are taking notes. That's the only part that I would say, you know what, if you take notes and put it right here, it's going to confuse you. So this is not part of the notes. What I want to begin our note taking with is the title, simply the expectations from this. We're reading this in context and we're setting ourselves up for interpretation of it. But the expectation, because when I read this, I'm reflecting back to first century Judaism and Jesus and his disciples having these clear expectations. Jesus having these clear expectations. And the crowd having these clear expectations. So I got three people involved: the rabbi, the disciples, and the crowd. This helps me remember, right? This is important. Now, the first expectation is that the disciples had an expectation of their rabbi. For the sake of writing in quotations or parentheses, you can put teacher / Jesus. But I would write down the disciples had an expectation of their rabbi. All right. The disciples had an expectation of their rabbi. I wouldn't put student because these are your notes that you may look at next year, right? Might be 12 turkeys later, and you look at these notes You want to know what it is. You know, we're talking about a disciple, like Bill said, a special type of learner, an unorthodox, extraordinary type of learner. Highly disciplined learner is what disciples are and were. And we're learning to become that. Yeah, we're learning to become that. But the disciples had an expectation of the rabbi. And you guys have an advantage because you know the 4 jobs of a disciple. Am I right? Anybody know the 4 jobs of a disciple? Now you can unmute Rick, Dr. Fred, John, if y'all want to comment on this part. Anybody know the 4 jobs of a disciple?
One of them was to memorize the words of his rabbi exactly.
Excellent. Excellent. So therefore, there was an expectation, right? Like, hey, the disciples had an expectation of the rabbi. Anybody remember the 2 jobs or the 2 main jobs of a teacher or rabbi?
Can you give the rest of those jobs of the disciple?
All right, I will. Thanks, Bradley. All right. There you go. Well,
were you asking what's the rabbi's expectation of the disciples? Is that what you were asking?
No, not yet. Not yet.
Okay.
What I was asking is, did anybody know the 4 jobs of the disciple? Dr. Fred gave us the first one. One more time, Dr. Fred.
To memorize the words of his rabbi exactly.
All right. Anybody know job number 2?
You repeat it strategically
Well,
in a way that's easily understood.
No, that's another title. So that's why now I'm glad you did it. That's why it's important to remember the title, not just the information that was given or the subtopics or the points, because a lot of times if I say 3, there's a lot of titles I've given in 3s, and you get them confused. So it's good to memorize and learn the title first. It's not unimportant. And that way I know why it was given and then where I'm to give it again back to. All right. So that's my first level of learning, is I always make sure I understand the title, or because I'm learning from somebody. So give me your title again. Give me your title again. Now I write the title down. Now, let me get your first point. So I'm asking the right question. But the 4 jobs of a disciple, I've said these often. I've given these out and repeated these, especially early on. The job number 1 is to memorize the words of the rabbi exactly. To memorize the words of the rabbi exactly. To memorize the words of the rabbi exactly. Job number 2 of the disciple. And these aren't the only jobs, but these were 4 main jobs disciples had in their culture. Job number 2 was to learn the traditions of your rabbi. To learn the traditions of your rabbi. Job number 2 was to learn the traditions of your rabbi. Job number 2 was to learn the traditions of your rabbi. To learn the traditions of the rabbi. Now, I got it. To learn the traditions of your rabbi, I don't have to ask to meet people anymore. I'm in control of this. All right, to learn the traditions of your rabbi. All right. Now, what we ask is, what are the traditions? That's the question. The traditions were how they interpreted, basically how they learned scripture, interpreted scripture. those were mostly the traditions of the rabbi. It's how the rabbi learned scripture and interpreted scripture. Basically, the traditions of the rabbi was centered around that. You know, how they applied these lessons to life, halakha. So, but we just simply in short say they learned the traditions of the rabbi. All right. So any fundamentals the rabbi knew in life and lived out, that's what the traditions were. All right. Job number 3 was to imitate the rabbi. To imitate these coming back to memory. Yep. Job number 3 was to imitate the rabbi.
Follow him to the restroom.
Yes, if it took it. Yeah, if it took, imitate. Yes. Thanks, Well. So coming back to memory for real.
Yep.
All right. So that's what they did. You know, it's like, hey, if I have a hard time memorizing his word, if I struggle in understanding his tradition, my default is, you know what? Let me just imitate him. Whatever he do and say, that's what I'm gonna do and say. And eventually I understand his tradition. And now I can memorize his word. So that was the goal. And job number 4, anybody remember job number 4? Raise up many disciples like my rabbi. Raise up many disciples like my rabbi. Yeah. Raise up many disciples like my rabbi. I'll add this since I'm here and I'll explain it later. That's why it was important when Matthew says his disciples came. See, when Matthew says his disciples came, they were committed to all 4 of these. Or it meant commitment to all 4 of those. But we don't get that in just reading this. We get it in understanding their life and their culture.
Keusi, just to confirm, the 3 expectations, the 2 jobs of the rabbi, the 4 jobs of the disciple, this was all known and understood by everyone, regardless of the teacher, the disciple, whatever they're teaching, right? Like this was expected across just the way the culture worked.
Yes. Everybody who was a disciple, everybody who was a rabbi, and everybody who was not in their culture knew this, understood it was a way of life. That's the difference. Say that again, Brother Wayne.
Yeah, I've got the 4 jobs of the disciple. I remember us going over that. What are the 2 jobs of the rabbi?
Thank you. We went back away from it, so thanks. Here we go. I think we're ready. So everybody in their culture knew a rabbi had 2 main jobs. It was to teach the commands of God and to interpret the commands of God. So a rabbi had 2 main jobs, to teach the commands of God and to interpret the commands of God.
The interpret is the second job?
Yes. Yeah. So first you taught the command. First a rabbi's responsibility was you can't teach them without knowing them. But you couldn't even become a disciple without knowing the command. But a rabbi's responsibility was to teach the command. Hold on, son, disciple. We're in this situation. The command of God says, honor the Sabbath, in this way. So it was to teach the commands of God. And then he had a responsibility to interpret them. Rabbi Shimon said in this scenario is that, when you see 2 people doing this, we should live it out in this way and honor this. That was the interpretation. And in our culture, that's how it came out of flow. It would always flow with this is the command in this situation. And this is what some rabbi taught me, and I learned how to apply this. But see, what we're getting ready for is the next level of that in the Sermon on the Mount. That's why we have to understand this. When we get down to the meat of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus began to do something only a rabbi with authority did. He went and taught the commands of God, which is what we see in the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of Torah, which is the commands of God. This group understood the Torah interpretations from the ancients. You have heard it said, the ancients have said. That meant somebody else had an interpretation. But he comes back and says, now I say. He gives proper interpretation, better interpretation, a clearer interpretation. They call that Shmika interpretation. Only rabbis with authority could bring new interpretation. So, and that's what he's doing. But Matthew is preparing us for this, and we jump into that, and we're not ready for it because Matthew is setting us up for it in verse 1 and 2 to be able to contain it, to have the capacity to understand it. Come on, Judge Wayne.
Yeah, you know, is one of the jobs of the rabbi not only to teach it, to interpret it, but to walk it out, his halakha?
Yes. So
is that another part? Would that be another job, or is that in a different category?
You know, in a rabbi's context, he would not interpret without the halakha.
Gotcha.
See, yep. If you go back and watch Jesus' teaching, none of his interpretations ended without his halakha.
So
that was
halakha was a part of the completion of the interpretation.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes. 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 Yeah. 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 All right. So again, what I'm helping us do is remember titles. Don't take notes without first asking if there's a title and understanding if there's a title. Come on, Bradley.
I had to take a phone call. Did I miss anything? Were y'all still talking about the two jobs of the rabbi?
Probably so. I'm willing to bet you did. Somebody help him out. Come on. That way we can see who got it.
I got the two jobs of the rabbi. Go ahead.
Well, I think if you got it, we talked about teach the commands of God and then interpret the commands of God, and just the Judge Wayne is pointing out that includes walking it out or the halakha.
Yeah. Okay. I'm good then.
What you got, Bradley? Let me hear what you got.
The two jobs of the rabbi are teach the commands of God and interpret the commands of God.
Okay, excellent.
I think y'all were just kind of talking about that a little more in depth, maybe.
Yes. All right.
I just wanted to throw in for anybody who's interested. I jumped on the Tuesday morning call with Soup. Soup has people repeat things like 6 times. Yeah. So Keusi's going easy on us.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, that's right. Right. Cause well, I'm gonna get into how many times it should be repeated in a moment. All right. We'll talk about what they did in their call. All right. Anybody? Rick, Fred, John, Dr. Fred, John, you guys remember the saying that determined how many times it was repeated in their call?
At least 100.
Excellent. Yes. At least 100. This was when we talk about memorizing the words of a rabbi. Come on, Brother Bill. I saw you on mute.
Is it about 600? Is it 500 or 600 times?
All right. Now they heard it. They heard it at least 600 times because they expected the rabbi to teach it 500 times.
Okay.
They expected the disciple to repeat it for themselves at least 100 times.
Okay.
All right. So they heard it 500 times in order for them to repeat it 100 times. Yeah.
You know, that's just amazing.
Yeah.
To me, that's that's just an amazing thing. Think how that would impact our culture if we had people, so often we feel like we got to come up with something new.
Yes.
And Jesus, apparently, from what I understand, was repetitively teaching certain things, uh, parables over and over and over again, so that his disciples were just saturated with these teachings. That's a totally different approach to communication than is.
Yeah, would that translate into parenting? I mean, I used to tell my kids, I don't want to tell you one time. Maybe I need to tell them 600 times.
Yeah, that's right.
I told mine 600 times.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You just need to get them to repeat it 100.
Yeah, they just never repeated it. Yeah.
And they still can't repeat it.
I think it would help us all too, and I'm sure we're thinking, Keusi's done a great job of instilling this in me from my personal point of view, but we have to understand that, Jesus was an observant Jew. I mean, he went to the temple 3 times a day. He made sacrifices. I mean, he was, it's not like he was the son of God and he could just do whatever he wanted to and he didn't have to obey the laws. I mean, he came to fulfill the law. I mean, he followed every dot and tittle, knew it as well as any rabbi. I think, and personally, I mean, he was. I'm sure he was more like he was like a Pharisee. Now he criticized the Pharisees, but the people loved the Pharisees because they had the seed of Moses, and Jesus actually told his disciples when he taught, he said, "You pay attention to what they tell you. They've got the seat of Moses, which means, they were on the Bema seat in the synagogues teaching Torah." And, we just forget that. We think, we've in our Western world and, since ever since the end of the first century, this whole culture has diverted. There was no Christianity. There was no such thing as Christianity when Jesus was walking this earth. It was Judaism, and within Judaism there were all different types, all sects, and Christianity was a sect of Judaism, just like the Essenes, just like Zealots, and they all worshipped in that temple. They all went to that temple, and that's where it happened, and they all worshipped in that temple, following the Torah. And that's never been communicated to me in my whole life sitting in church. I never really understood until Keusi, just repeated 100 times. We've got to have the context. We have to understand what it was like. I mean, how did Matthew, how did those 12 understand what it was that Jesus was telling them? Because they don't fill in the blanks because they already knew it all. And that's where we are as disciples, is we just really have to understand first who Jesus was. I mean, he was an observant Jew. He was not, Jesus is a Jew. It's not Jesus was a Jew. Jesus is a Jew.
Can we throw an additional piece on that too? Because I've discovered I could read something 100 times, and it's different if I say it out loud 100 times. There's something about saying stuff out loud that just helps.
Yeah, hearing it in your own voice, it transfers ownership of it, right? Like I hear it, but when I say it out loud, now I'm hearing it in my voice. And it does something. Yeah. Yeah.
Keusi, that reminds me of the learning pyramid.
Yes.
Where the most retention that a person has from what he has learned from others is when he begins to teach it. Yes. He begins to say it, and I think it's like a 96% retention rate. Right. Whereas every other method of learning, just hearing or discussing, the retention rate is not nearly as high. So that's good to hear what Robert just said there. You know, that's big. We got to teach it.
It is. It is. Yeah. Saying it out loud, hearing it out voice. That's why I started off saying that it's important for us to envision the person that I want to teach it to or transmit it to. It starts to shape the way I hear and learn, and the purpose of it makes it even more important, greater responsibility. Now, I'll most likely follow through with that, and I'll get a chance to hear myself say it. You know, so yeah, it's harder to sit in an empty room and say it out loud than it is to say it to somebody sitting there with me. So yeah, so yeah, so yeah. All right.
Keusi, one thing that stands out about what you're teaching here is that the with me time that you talked about in other lessons, because you can't hear something from a rabbi 500 times if you're not with them.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And that's the part I have to imagine, right? Like they heard it from the rabbi 500 times. Was that in one day, 1 week, 1 month? We don't know. But we just know that the rabbi availed himself and they pursued enough to be there, right? Yeah. So I'll give a physical example with Dr. Fred and John and Rick now. They've heard me say this because they popped in on my Sunday group. And they show up and they don't not say, well, I'll wait till Sunday to get this. They show up on the Friday, you know, or vice versa, and they come in as if they didn't hear it on Friday or Sunday, you know, because it's about the repetition. And they'll probably tell you, you know what, I think I heard some stuff on this one I didn't hear on that one, or vice versa. It just happens that way, you know, because of the discussion style, you know. So yeah, so yeah. And y'all hear me say this. I'm just as dependent on the audio as y'all are. I have to relearn from myself. I'm like, oh, that ain't in my notes. Let me go back and listen to that. Because it came up in a question or a discussion that really caused you to think about something you didn't intend to have to explain or thought you needed to explain, but you realized it was important to explain. So yeah. Good stuff. All right, good stuff. Great question. All right. So now let me recap. We have 3 titles and 3 lessons we've learned. We have 3 titles, 2 full lessons we learned, and the beginning of another. Somebody sort that out for me. Tell me what I'm talking about.
Okay, title of this lesson that we start, well, three titles are the 3 expectations, 2 jobs of the rabbi, 4 jobs of the disciple.
Excellent.
You want to hear the points for each of those?
Yes.
Okay, the 3 expectations. Number 1, the disciple or Talmud had an expectation of the rabbi.
Excellent.
Number 2, the rabbi had an expectation of the disciple. And number 3, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
Yeah. Excellent.
Brother Webb, when I grow up, I want to be just like you.
I'm following you, Fred.
Amen.
Hey, my question though, I had the 3 must-dos, not the 3 expectations.
So we never got into the must-do. Bradley started it. Unfortunately, I cut him off.
Okay.
We were talking about something else, but we start on that. So that would actually make 4 topics.
All right, but we ain't amplified that one yet.
We have not.
Okay, I'm correcting my notes.
Yeah, we have not.
3 expectations.
Yeah.
That's the title.
Yes.
That's the topic.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
It does help to repeat.
Yeah, give those to us again, Webb.
Yeah, okay. 3 expectations is the title. The first is the disciple had an expectation of the rabbi. The second, the teacher had an expectation of the disciples. And number three, the crowd had an expectation of Jesus's disciples.
Excellent. Excellent.
Is there something we should say the three expectations of and have some definition than just three expectations? It seems like there's lacking clarity if you were trying to communicate three expectations, you know, of my kids, you know, it's not because you got a teacher, a rabbi, and a crowd. It's hard to come up with something. I realize that, but it seems like it ought to be three expectations of, because expectations may come up again or have in other areas. You know, what does that make sense? I mean, other ones, we got 4 jobs of a disciple, you know, two main jobs of a rabbi, but then we just got 3 expectations.
That's exactly right, Bill. And a lot of times when you're teaching, you figure it out as you go. I ain't figured that out yet because there's so many ways I can go. Just being transparent.
Okay.
You know, because this is my reason. Or this is my confusion, my knowing. Like, do I say the 3 expectations of the Jewish culture? Do I say the 3 rabbinical expectations in the Jewish culture? So the jury is still out. And hopefully we can all figure it out and settle it in, because what I'm trying to think of is something that's easily rememberable and transferable. So I hadn't settled in on that yet. So yeah.
All right, let's okay. Excuse me. So it's three must do's. That was one that Bradley started, but we cut him off. Then we got the 3 expectations, 2 jobs of the rabbi, and what was that other one that you gave us?
4 jobs of the disciple.
Okay, thank you.
All right, but we ain't done the must do's yet.
Yeah, we
never got to that. And to my way of thinking, on the expectations, you either have to use rabbi every time or teacher every time.
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Okay. Yep.
That's the way it seems to me.
That's
Yep.
right. What are we
Also,
on, Rick?
also on our notes, what we said right now until we get a title is God expectation / 3 expectations.
Okay. Yeah.
Huh.
And then we settle in on saying rabbi in our understanding, because we realize who's speaking and what they would have heard and what they saw. But then we would explain teacher and student based on their culture and what a rabbi was and what a student was as far as the rabbinic culture.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Does that help, Brother Bill?
Well, it does, but can we boil that down to what the title would be again, Rick?
God's expectation / 3 expectations.
You're saying God's expectations?
Yes, sir. God's expectations / 3 expectation. And we were just using that temporarily till we came up with something else.
Oh, okay.
And let me explain why. The reason why I lean away from saying or saying, okay, confidently, let's look at the 3 expectations of the Jewish culture. Well, that leaves us out.
Right.
You know, because these are expectations, and I'll get into it, but I'm compiling a lot for you to memorize or remember. But if I get into the expectation and I start saying this is just only the 3 expectations in the Jewish culture, then I eliminate the responsibility you and I have in this.
Uh-huh.
And ultimately, these aren't just the disciple had expectations of the rabbi. These aren't just the rabbi had expectations of the disciple. These aren't just the crowds had expectations of Jesus' disciples. But when you think about who inspired the expectations, there was responsibilities. So that means in expectation number one, who had the responsibility?
The rabbi.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. I've been in three other groups. Nobody got it right like that on the first one. Excellent. The rabbi had the responsibility. Who had the responsibility number two?
Wait. Why would the rabbi have the responsibility?
Say it again. Somebody say it so we can answer.
Because it seems to me it's the disciples had an expectation. No, that's right. I'm sorry. I'm wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, the rabbi had expectations.
Delete my statements.
You would draw that motion.
Proceed, counsel.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
guess what you just did?
Delete that from the transcript.
Yeah.
Strike that from the record.
Yeah. But guess what he just did? As soon as he said it out loud in his own words, he understood.
Yeah.
Yep. He said it out loud with his own words. Then he said, oh, I got it. Makes sense. So yeah. All right. So number one, who had the expectation? I'm sorry. Stop.
Huh?
Who had the responsibility? I'm sorry.
I just want to say one thing before you go on. Those guys were totally out of order in chastising me. Okay.
You're the judge.
That's right. Don't forget it.
Yeah. Yeah. Who had the responsibility in number one?
The rabbi.
Who had the responsibility in number two?
Disciples.
All right. Number three is confusion. Who had the responsibility in number three?
The disciple.
All right. Let's say it together.
The crowds.
Yeah. Explain to us why. Rick, you remember why?
Yes, because the crowd had the responsibility to pursue the disciples to hear.
Yes. See, the crowd had to depend on the disciple because they weren't present to hear the rabbi. So now they have a responsibility to pursue the rabbi to hear. To pursue the disciple to hear what the rabbi said. So we think about the responsibility.
So number two, you said was the crowd?
Number two is the disciple.
Okay. Three is the crowd.
Number three is the responsibility was on the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
The crowd had the responsibility.
Why didn't the crowd have expectations of the rabbi?
All right.
Because they came to hear. That's two they came to hear.
Yeah. They came to hear, but when we think about the expectations of let's say it again out loud. What's expectation number three?
No, I'm thinking that is there a fourth? I wasn't questioning number three. I was saying, did we omit a number four?
Well, in all outline points and teaching, we can always expand them out, even like the jobs of a disciple or the jobs of a teacher. Sometimes we settle in because sometimes some of those things can be explained within one of those other points. All right. And this is one of those scenarios when we think about, the overall complexity of it. One is it goes back to what I asked. Who are the three characters? Who are the three responsible people in these?
The rabbi, the teacher, the crowd.
Yes. So when we think about the three people who have responsibility in these, we define, we can ask the same question around each one who had responsibility. What was happening in one? What was happening in one? Number one, the expectation number one, what was happening?
Rabbi was teaching.
And the
The
disciples
rabbi
were
was
listening.
Yeah, and the disciples were listening. Who had
And
the
following.
expectation?
Excuse me.
Say it again, Judge Wayne.
Well, I think they were following too. I mean, they were listening, but listening with the intention of following and trying to imitate their rabbi.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. True, true. Which is what Matthew is showing us. He don't say they followed, they pursued. He just says the disciples came, which shows or reflects following and pursuit. But what we're settling in on is that created expectation. One of the things I think I shared with a different group, I don't know if I said this with this group, is if you go back and research learning styles and success in learning, it's the teacher or the facilitator who clearly defines the expectations to the group. When an adult has clear expectations that they can follow, they usually tend to retain and learn better, which is why we're covering this. So we're defining the clear expectation. So now, who had the expectation in number one?
The disciples.
Who had that? Who was the expectation of?
The rabbi.
That places the responsibility on the rabbi.
Ah, okay.
Correct.
That helps.
Yep. Places the responsibility on the rabbi.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So now the facilitator has a responsibility. So guess what? One day I'm going to be a rabbi. One day I'm going to be a rabbi who teaches. One day I'm going to be a rabbi who facilitates. So that means I have a responsibility, and I have to go into this with the right expectation that those I teach have expectations of me. Therefore, I can live up to the responsibility. All right. Because now it establishes accountability. Now the teacher, the rabbi, has held himself accountable to the group. And this accountability is what? I'm getting a little deeper into this. We're going to clean it up later. We won't clean it up today. Let me explain for the sake of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good.
The responsibility is that I'm going to teach it enough until my students know it. Therefore, I teach it at least 500 times if it takes. My students memorizing it word for word. So it shows my responsibility, and it helps clarify the expectations the disciples had of me.
You know, Keusi, that is so good, because what you're saying is as a teacher, you set standards.
Yes.
And, you know, that's something I have to continually remind myself, because I have a tendency to, oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
And reduce a standard, which if you reduce it for one, you're reducing it for all. And the impact of your teaching is just greatly diminished by doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks.
Thank you. Now, what's one discipline we've adopted as a group to ensure that the teacher teaches it at least 500 times? We've adopted something that we don't even realize.
We record it.
Excellent. That's it. The recording gives us access to 500 times. Yes. And we often do what when we come back? We review.
Review.
Repeat, review, and repeat.
Review and repeat. So you guys hear me say these things at least 500 times. If you really think about it. Come on, Dr. Fred.
We also take notes.
Yes, we take notes. Yes, yes. Now, taking notes shifts us to number two. All right. So what's expectation number 2?
The disciples had an expectation of the rabbi.
All right, one more time. Expectation number 2. Think about it.
The disciples had an expectation of the rabbi.
Yeah, that's expectation number 1.
Yeah. Number 2 would be the teacher had an expectation of the disciples.
All right. So let's replace teacher with rabbi.
Rabbi, okay.
Yeah. So number 1 was the disciples had the expectation of the rabbi. So the disciples expected something of the rabbi. Therefore, the rabbi had a responsibility to them. That created accountability. Number 2 was what? Again,
the rabbi had an expectation of the disciples.
So when the disciples came to him, they didn't come without knowing the rabbi had an expectation of them. That created accountability. Matthew knows this. Matthew is strategic in all of this. So now the rabbi has an expectation of the disciples when they come. That places the responsibility on the disciple. And now that makes the disciple take notes, Dr. Fred. Now that makes the disciple repeat it 100 times until they can repeat it for themselves or memorize it. All right. Now let's get into the difficult one before we close out. Number 3.
An expectation of Jesus' disciples.
I think that's number 2, Dr. Fred. Number 3.
The crowd.
Expectation of the crowd.
Come on, Rick, help us out.
The crowd had expectation of Jesus' disciples.
Yes.
The rabbi's disciples.
The rabbi's disciples. So in this culture, when a group gathered like this, they gathered knowing that the crowd had expectations of the rabbi's disciples. When they gathered, the crowds in this culture had expectation of the rabbi's disciples because the rabbis knew the disciples had a responsibility. I'm sorry, the crowd knew the disciples had if they were called a disciple, the crowd knew the disciples had a responsibility. They knew the disciples were learning and memorizing the rabbi's teachings. That was the purpose of them being a disciple. They wouldn't have been called a disciple of a rabbi if they weren't learning the rabbi's teaching. And they wouldn't still be a rabbi's disciple. See, they wouldn't even be considered, a rabbi wouldn't even continue to call you a disciple if you weren't memorizing his teaching. The crowd knew this, which is why some of the people in the crowd weren't disciples themselves yet. However, you got to think about it. There comes a time when someone in the crowd who's not a disciple realizes, you know what? There's something going on here. So this is what we say. If they weren't present to hear the rabbi's lesson, they expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson to them when necessary. If they weren't present to hear the rabbi's lesson, they expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson to them when necessary. We added that when necessary intentionally, right? It's because they're made, once again, this is why we say this for us. Come on, Dr. Fred.
So expectation number 3 is the crowd had an expectation of the rabbi's disciples.
Correct.
Did I get it right? Okay, that's what I want to know. Okay, thank you.
Correct. Excellent. All right. Yeah, driving and talking and writing and talking is different, ain't it, Dr. Fred? You got to get it right.
Just a little bit. Just a little bit.
Yeah, works that cornea in your brain a little differently. Yeah, all right, but yeah. So
Well,
yeah,
I'm loving it. I'm loving it.
yeah, man, yeah. All right. Hey, you more related, you more connected to Soup than you ever have been before now. So yeah. Because a lot of times now he has to memorize by just repeating stuff out loud versus writing a lot of stuff. So yeah. But yes. All right. So once again, number 3, somebody.
The crowd had an expectation of the rabbi's disciples.
All right. Excellent. And what was that expectation?
That they could repeat and teach the words of the rabbi to them.
All right. So let's say it in a similar way. Come on, Rick. We want to adopt this. We want to adopt repeating it the same first. First, we want to just, Soup used to say this all the time. He said, in the first century, you know, they obeyed to understand. They didn't try to understand before they obeyed. They just simply obeyed. So that means they took what someone was teaching them and they obeyed it. And after obedience, they tried to understand it. But in our culture, it's different. In our culture, we try to understand before we obey. And what that leads us to is before I can actually learn it, I want to understand it so I can learn it. I want to understand it so I can repeat it. And it tends to cause us to have variant messages or variant statements about the same thing. But what we're learning to do is first, we want to obey first. We want to adopt the same statement about it first. And then we want to try to process it and understand. All right. The reason being is this. You guys did it before. You ever played that circle game and you're right next to each other and you whisper something in somebody's ear, and the goal is to see whether or not, when it gets back to the person who originated, whether or not it's changed. And what usually happens in that game?
It usually changes.
It usually changes. Yeah, it's fun, but it usually changes.
At the end, it's nothing like the beginning.
Nothing like the beginning. And what we want to remember is there's future generations at stake, at least 4. See, that's something I never lose sight of. As a teacher and a disciple, I'm responsible to the 4th generation. So to ensure that I don't compromise the next generation, I first want to be able to say it exactly the way I heard it. All right, that gives me a greater chance of understanding and explaining it the way it was explained and mentioned to me. And we have to do that by adopting certain statements together. And that's what we're doing here. So we agreed to adopt a certain explanation of this. And then we can go back and say it different ways to explain it to somebody else. But let's first adopt it the way we hear it. All right. And this is how we learn. We want to make sure we continue to use the word crowd, rabbi, and disciple. Those are the 3 responsible parties. Those are the 3 parties that had expectation. Number 3 is the crowd had an expectation of the rabbi's disciples. We know Jesus is this particular rabbi, and we know Jesus is a teacher, but we use the crowd had an expectation of the rabbi's disciples. Now, here's the expectation. Let's try to get this word for word, so I'm going to repeat it at least 3 or 4 times. If the crowd were not present, 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 to hear the rabbi's lesson, 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 to hear the rabbi's lesson. They expected the rabbi's disciples. 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 They expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson. 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 To them when necessary. 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 All right. Now.
May I repeat that out loud, teacher?
Yes, sir.
Expectation number 3 is the crowd had an expectation of the rabbi's disciples if they were not present to repeat the rabbi's teaching in a way, to repeat the rabbi's teaching when necessary.
All right. All right.
I didn't get it quite right. I didn't get it. Okay.
Somebody help them out.
Their expectation, the crowds had an expectation of the disciples to, if they were not present, that the disciples would teach the rabbi's lesson. If they were not present to hear the rabbi's lesson, the disciples would repeat the rabbi's lesson when necessary.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. Clean this up.
Hey, Keusi.
Yes, sir.
What I wrote down is if the crowd were not present to hear the rabbi's lesson, they expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson to them when necessary.
Excellent. Excellent. That's word for word. One more time, Chris.
If the crowd were not present to hear the rabbi's lesson, they expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson to them when necessary.
Yes. Word for word.
Can I ask the question?
Yes, sir.
If they were present, would they still have that same expectation?
All right. I think they would have the same expectation if they couldn't remember or what was said.
Right.
In the culture, what we're learning and what we're trying to understand is how the crowd would lean on the disciples of a rabbi. They may not have the chutzpah to approach the rabbi.
Yeah.
They may not have the relationship to approach the rabbi. But what if they felt more comfortable approaching a disciple? I'll give an example.
Yeah, mine was whether they were present or not present. It seems like they would want the disciple to repeat the lesson to them when necessary.
Okay.
If that was their first time and it was the disciples' 150th time, wouldn't, even if they were there, wouldn't they expect the disciple to repeat the lesson?
Yeah.
I mean, we're saying they're only saying if the crowd were not present. I would say if the crowd were not present, or if they were present, they would. The rest of it would be true.
Yeah, yeah. So correct. And in this statement, we're not trying to explain every scenario. We're just giving a scenario so we can have a base of understanding the culture's perspective in these responsibilities.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we're trying to make it where it's easily rememberable, but we're not dismissing the fact that the crowd will want to, whether they were present or not present. We're just trying to simplify it in some ways as well. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, we also got the thought that he was talking to 5,000 people at one time without a megaphone, and
Yes.
so sometimes the repetition was going on live stream,
Yeah.
so to
Yeah.
speak.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I think the key to help explain both is the statement of when necessary. So now when we add when necessary, that kind of goes back and clears all that up. If I was present or not present, it's just when it's necessary for me to know what the rabbi said, I can expect that the rabbi's disciples can repeat it to me. But here, we're just learning to try to find a common statement we all begin and memorize with. And then we can explain it in multiple ways so the audience will teach it to. But we want to at least transfer it in a similar way, if that makes sense. So yeah. Yeah. All right. All right. One more time, Chris.
If the crowd were not present to hear the rabbi's lesson, they expected the rabbi's disciples to be able to repeat the rabbi's lesson to them when necessary.
All right. Time is short. I got to run as well. But we started this trying to explain the responsibility. The responsibility here is hearing the rabbi's lesson. The responsibility number two is the disciples and had the responsibility to repeat the rabbi's lesson. In number one, the rabbi had a responsibility to teach it enough until somebody could repeat it. So responsibility number one is on the rabbi. Responsibility number two is on the disciple. Responsibility number three is on the crowd. So that's kind of where we get that from, if that makes sense. All right. Yeah. Yeah. And guess what? We're going to start from the top next week and do it all again. So appreciate you, man. This was good. I gotta get out of here. Anybody want to pray us out, and we'll jump back in next week.
I'll do it. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time. We thank you for your word that you've left us with, dear God, to have a more complete and full understanding of who you are in our relationship with you and our relationship with others. Pray that you'll be with each person as they go about their work or their business today, dear God, and give them a sense of your presence as we try to sow the gospel seed. We ask in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you,
Have a
man.
blessed day, guys.
Appreciate
All
it.
right, you too. See you, Bill. See you guys.